Welcome to Part 3 of Module 2. After identifying the bones of the head, let us now continue discussing other parts of the actual skeleton like the vertebrae, the ribs, and the sternum. At the end of this presentation, you should be able to write the vertebral formula of dog, identify the total number of rib pairs present, and its relation to the number of sternebrae. First, let us see the general arrangement of the vertebrae, ribs, and sternum in the body of an animal. The vertebrae are located at the dorsal midline. The rib forms a lateral bony structure supporting the thorax, while the sternum are located at the ventral midline. The vertebral column is composed of a number of unpaired bones called vertebrae arranged in a series along the midline of the body and extending from the base of the skull to the tip of the tail. The vertebrae can be grouped based on their location. Cervical vertebrae are located at the neck region. The thoracic vertebrae are located at the level of the chest. Lumbar vertebrae are those present at the loin area. Sacral vertebrae are the fused vertebrae at the level of the pelvic area. And finally, the caudal vertebrae which supports the tail. Vertebral formula represents the number of specific vertebrae in an animal. The number is constant except for the caudal vertebrae. Take note that the number varies per species. In dog, the vertebral formula is C7, T13, L7, S3, Ca20 to 24. This means that the dog has 7 cervical vertebrae, 13 thoracic vertebrae, 7 lumbar vertebrae, 3 sacral vertebrae, and around 20 to 24 caudal vertebrae. Remember that vertebrae are classified as irregular bones because of their irregular shape. However, most of the vertebrae have the basic parts in common. A typical vertebra has a body, an arc, and number of processes. Let's identify the parts of a vertebra. This is the 6th cervical vertebra. The body is a cylindrical mass forming the ventral part of the vertebra and the floor of the vertebral foramen. It is convex cranially as shown here and concave caudally. The vertebral arc completes the vertebral foramen dorsally. The arc is composed of a lamina and pedicle. The lamina forms the roof of the arc, while the pedicle forms the wall of the arc. On the average, there are 7 processes present at the vertebral arc. There is a single spinous process that projects dorsally from the arc of the vertebra. The paired transverse processes project laterally from the arc. There are also 4 articular processes, 2 cranial and 2 caudal articular processes. They form joints between adjacent vertebrae. The vertebral foramen is the space formed by the vertebral arc and the body. The vertebral foramina of all vertebrae form the vertebral canal. The paired transverse foramen is an opening present at the transverse process through which vertebral artery passes. There are 7 cervical vertebrae in mammals. These are the vertebrae at the neck region. They are characterized by a massive appearance and by the presence of transverse foramen as discussed previously. This slide shows examples of the cervical vertebrae. Note that they have different views of presentation. C1 or atlas and C2 or axis are considered as atypical, meaning they are not similar in appearance with the rest of the cervical vertebrae. 3rd to 5th cervical vertebrae are almost the same with the 6th cervical vertebra. The 7th cervical vertebra lacks the transverse foramen and has a tall spinous process. We will just focus on the 1st and 2nd cervical vertebrae. The 1st cervical vertebra is the atlas. The name of this bone was derived from the Greek mythology character Atlas, which was given the task of holding up the heavens. The same with the 1st cervical vertebra, it is holding the head in place with the rest of the body. Morphologically, the atlas is atypical. It does not follow the same structures present in most vertebrae. Some books consider the body of Atlas to be absent, but in some it is described as a thin structure forming the ventrum of the bone. This is in contrast to the bulky body of other vertebrae. Here is a dorsal and caudal view of the atlas. Take note that it lacks spinous process. The transverse processes are modified into wings. It has a transverse foramen and lateral vertebral foramen. The alar foramen is modified into alar notch. The presence of alar notch is characteristic of a dog atlas. The axis or epistropheus is the second cervical vertebra. It has a tooth-like bony projection at the cranial end called dens or odontoid process, which articulate with the atlas forming a pivot joint. Take note that it has a large ridge-like spinous process. The thoracic vertebra is characterized by the tall spinous process, short body, and transverse processes. The thoracic vertebrae articulate with the rib, thus it has structures specialized for such. The transverse fovea is a plane surface at the transverse process of the vertebra that articulates with the tubercle of the rib. On the other hand, the costal fovea is a plane surface that articulate with the head of the ribs. They are located at the body of the vertebra. In dogs, there are 13 number of rib pairs. Look at this schematic drawing of the thoracic vertebrae of dog. Observe that the spinous processes are oriented caudally until one spinous process is vertically inclined. This vertebra is called the anticlinal vertebra. In contrast, the spinous processes of the vertebrae caudal to the anticlinal vertebra is oriented cranially. The anticlinal vertebra of dog is T11. As we recall, the lumbar vertebrae are located at the loin area. The lumbar vertebrae can be distinguished from the rest of the vertebrae because of its large, flat, or plate-like transverse processes that project laterally. In addition to other processes present in other vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae has an accessory process. Note that these are present from the mid-thoracic vertebrae to the lumbar vertebrae. This should not be confused with a ruptured intervertebral disc. They also have mammillary process which are present at the cranial articular processes. Bodies and the processes of the three sacral vertebrae fuse to form the sacrum. Here is a lateral, dorsal, and ventral view of the sacrum. The median sacral crest is the fused spinous processes present at the dorsal surface of the sacrum. The wing forms the lateral parts of the sacrum that articulates with the hip bone to form the sacroiliac joint. You can also observe paired openings seen at the dorsal and ventral views. These are the dorsal and ventral sacral foramina. These are for the passage of the spinal nerves. The promontory is a transverse ridge at the cranioventral part of the base. This can be best seen on a cranial or ventral view. The vertebrae of the tail has an average number of 20 but may range between 6 to 24. They became smaller distally until it became a rod-like structure. Hemal arches are present as a separate bone that articulates with the ventral surface of the 4th, 5th, and 6th caudal vertebrae. In life, this structure is protecting the median caudal artery. Again, here are the segments of the vertebral column: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and caudal vertebrae. Take note that in writing the vertebral formula, it must be written in chronological order. After finishing the bones of the vertebral column, let us now discuss the bones of the thorax. This is a bony cavity formed by the sternum, ribs, costal cartilages, and the bodies of the thoracic vertebrae. These bones support and protect the soft tissues and organs of the thoracic cavity, like the lungs and the heart. Ribs are long, curved bone forming the lateral walls of the thorax. Usually, the number of pairs of ribs is the same with the number of the thoracic vertebrae. Remember that the thoracic vertebrae is 13 in number. Thus, the number of rib pairs is also 13. Ribs can be classified depending on their articulation with the sternum. Sternal or true ribs articulates with the sternum by means of its costal cartilage. The costal cartilages are cartilaginous cylindrical distal continuation of the bony rib. Sternal ribs are also known as immobile ribs. There are 9 pairs of sternal ribs in dog. Asternal or false ribs have no direct attachment with the sternum. However, their cartilages are fused to form the costal arc. They are also called the respiratory rib because they are mobile. There are 3 pairs of asternal ribs in dog. Here is the costal arc. It is formed by the costal cartilages of the 10th, 11th, and 12th rib with the last segment of the sternum. The last is the floating rib. It has no connection with the sternum and no cartilage is present. It is usually the last rib and found only in dog and man. Let us then discuss the parts of a rib. The head of the rib articulates with the costal fovea of the thoracic vertebrae. The neck of the rib connects the head to the body or shaft of the rib. The tubercle of the rib is a bony, small prominence lateral to the head that articulates with the transverse fovea of the thoracic vertebrae. The sternum forms the ventrum of the bony thorax and gives attachment to the costal cartilages of the ribs, as well as providing a bony origin for the pectoral muscles. The sternum consists of 8 individual bones called sternebrae that tend to fuse as age advances. Manubrium is the first segment of the sternum. It is longer than the other sternebrae. The body is the middle portion composed of several sternebrae. And finally, the xiphoid process is the last segment of the sternum. It is wide and flat, and it holds the xiphoid cartilage. That ends our lecture on the remaining parts of the axial skeleton. I hope you are now able to differentiate vertebrae from one another, familiar with the vertebral formula of dog, the number of rib pairs, and segments of the sternum. A short quiz on this part module is prepared for you to answer. After that, you may now proceed to part 4 of module 2, which is the bones of the thoracic limb.